Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Ghostly Inn. The wind howled as Holly Arnold arrived at the small, remote inn on the Isle of Wight. Perched atop a windswept cliff, the Hackstead Inn stood as a lonely sentinel overlooking the sea. The darkened sky cast an eerie glow over the building, and a chilling mist curled around its ancient stone walls. Holly pulled her coat tighter around her, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over her the moment she set foot on the island. The innkeeper, an old man with watery blue eyes and a face lined with years of weathered hardship, greeted her at the entrance. "Welcome to the Hackstead Inn, Miss Arnold," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Not many visitors come this time of year." He handed her an old-fashioned key on a brass ring. "Room 12, top of the stairs. Try to stay in your room after dark and, if you hear anything strange, just ignore it." Holly raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by strange?" The innkeeper hesitated, his gaze shifting to the shadowy staircase behind him. "Just the wind, and the old pipes, nothing to worry about." With a forced smile, Holly nodded and made her way up the creaking staircase, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The inn was colder inside than she had expected, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The dim light from the sconces flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like whispers in the dark. Her room, when she reached it, was simple but cozy. A large four-poster bed dominated the space, draped in heavy curtains that seemed to shiver despite the still air. A small window overlooked the crashing waves far below the cliffs, and the wind rustled the panes incessantly. Holly set her bags down and sat on the bed, trying to shake off the growing unease gnawing at her stomach. Something about this place felt wrong. Night fell quickly, and as the hours ticked by, the inn grew quieter. Holly tried to distract herself with a book she had brought, but the unsettling silence pressed in on her, broken only by the occasional creak or thud from the old building settling. The air seemed to grow heavier, and an odd sense of being watched crawled over her skin. Around midnight, just as Holly was beginning to drift off, she heard it, soft at first, like a distant murmur. Voices. They seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside her room. Curious and unnerved, she crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. The voices were indistinct, a jumble of whispers and sobs. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her pulse quickening. Maybe it's just other guests, she thought, but the inn had been empty when she arrived, and the innkeeper hadn't mentioned anyone else. She opened the door cautiously and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder out here, and the whispers were louder now, though still unintelligible. They seemed to be coming from the far end of the corridor, where a narrow staircase led to the attic. The stairs. Something about them sent a jolt of fear through her, but she couldn't stop herself. She took a tentative step forward, then another, the floorboards creaking under her weight. As she neared the attic stairs, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. A door slammed somewhere below, followed by a sharp, agonizing scream that echoed through the inn. Holly froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The scream died away, leaving only the sound of the wind howling outside. Suddenly, the light above her flickered and went out. She was plunged into darkness. Panic gripped her. She fumbled for her phone, but when she turned on the flashlight, the beam barely penetrated the thick, oppressive gloom. Something was terribly wrong. She could feel it, a presence, something watching her from the shadows. And then, without warning, the voices returned, louder than ever. They were closer now, circling her. Holly stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. She turned to run back to her room, but the door to the attic creaked open, slowly, as if inviting her inside. "No," she whispered, backing away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But as she turned to flee, the hallway behind her stretched impossibly long, the exit far out of reach. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with an oppressive weight. A cold hand brushed against her arm, sending a shock of terror through her. She spun around, but there was no one there, only the shadowy figure at the top of the attic stairs, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, its form twisted and unnatural, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The whispers swelled to a cacophony, drowning out her thoughts, filling her mind with 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. She clutched her head, trying to block them out, but it was no use. They were inside her now, pulling her toward the attic. "Help me!" a voice cried out from the darkness. Holly froze. It was a woman's voice, desperate and filled with fear. She turned back toward the attic stairs, her flashlight flickering. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. For a moment there was only silence. And then, from the shadows, the figure stepped forward. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. "They're coming for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to leave, before it's too late." Holly backed away, her heart racing. "What do you mean? Who's coming?" The woman shook her head. "The inn, it's cursed, trapped. No one who stays here leaves, not alive." A cold dread settled over Holly as the woman's words sunk in. The shadows seemed to shift around her, growing darker, more tangible. She had to get out. Now. She turned and bolted for the stairs, her feet pounding against the creaky floorboards. But as she ran, the walls of the inn warped and twisted, the hallway stretching endlessly before her. The door at the inn seemed farther and farther away, no matter how fast she ran. Behind her the whispers turned to laughter, hollow, mocking. And then the floor beneath her feet gave way, and she was falling, tumbling into the dark void below. She landed hard, the wind knocked out of her. Gasping for breath, Holly struggled to her feet and looked around. She was in the basement now, a cold, damp room with stone walls and a low ceiling. Faint light filtered in from a narrow window, illuminating rows of old wooden coffins lined up against the walls. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, and as Holly moved toward the far wall, her flashlight beam caught something, a door, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. She rushed toward it, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the rusted handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase leading down into the darkness. Holly hesitated for only a moment before plunging into the unknown. The stairs seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers followed her, never far behind. She could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic plink echoing through the stone passageway. At last she reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in a large, cavernous chamber. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, slick with moisture and covered in strange, ancient symbols. Around it, flickering torches cast eerie shadows on the walls. And there, lying on the altar, was the innkeeper. His eyes snapped open, glowing with a malevolent light. "Welcome, Holly Arnold," he rasped, his voice no longer his own. "We've been waiting for you." Before Holly could scream, the whispers surged around her, consuming her mind. The last thing she saw was the innkeeper rising from the altar, his body shifting into something grotesque, inhuman. And then darkness. Days later, when authorities arrived at the inn after a tip from a concerned friend, they found no trace of Holly Arnold. The innkeeper, too, was missing, though the locals whispered that the Haxted Inn had been abandoned for years. The only thing left behind was a tattered journal, its pages filled with frantic scribbles. The last entry simply read, "Don't come here." They're waiting. The search for Holly Arnold didn't stop after the authorities left. Her close friends and family pushed the local police to keep investigating, though no new leads emerged. Holly had simply vanished. The Isle of Wight, known for its picturesque views and quaint villages, was cast under a heavy shadow. Whispers grew among the islanders about the cursed Haxted in a place they had long avoided. Months passed, and the inn became a magnet for the curious and the brave. Paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and ghost hunters all arrived, hoping to unravel the mystery of Holly's disappearance and the legends of the inn's sinister past. One of those drawn to the island was Amelia Royce, a seasoned journalist who had made a name for herself covering unsolved mysteries and supernatural events. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in stories that could make or break her career. Amelia arrived at the Haxted Inn on a rainy autumn afternoon. The weather was dreary, much like the day Holly had arrived nearly a year earlier. The inn stood unchanged, its stone walls still defiant against the elements, though it felt somehow more lifeless now, like a place frozen in time. As she entered the inn, Amelia felt the chill that others had described, but she brushed it off. Years of investigative work had taught her to be skeptical, to look for the facts hidden beneath the surface. She checked in with the current caretaker, an elderly woman named Mrs. Morley, who had agreed to let her stay for a few nights. Amelia asked as she took her key, glancing around the empty lobby. Mrs. Morley's wrinkled face twisted into a half-smile. Not many come round any more, as you can imagine. You sure you want to stay here, love? You won't find much peace. It's exactly what I'm here for. Amelia said the truth. What really happened to Holly Arnold? Mrs. Morley's eyes darkened. Best not go looking for the truth, miss. Some things are meant to stay buried. But Amelia wasn't deterred. She'd heard warnings like this before in her line of work. She smiled politely and headed up to her room. Her first night at the inn was uneventful, though she had trouble sleeping. The wind rattled the windows, and every now and then she thought she heard distant whispers, but she chalked it up to her imagination. She spent the next day exploring the island, interviewing locals who had once known Holly. Most of them had little to offer beyond speculation and old ghost stories about the inn, rumors of strange deaths, missing guests, and the innkeeper who had vanished along with Holly. It wasn't until her second night that things took a turn. Amelia had spent hours combing through old newspaper archives and documents related to the inn's history. By the time she returned to her room, she was exhausted. She fell into a deep sleep almost instantly, but she wasn't alone for long. She awoke with a start, her heart racing. The room was cold, colder than it had any right to be. She sat up in bed, a breath visible in the air, and that's when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside her door. Someone was walking down the hallway. Amelia reached for her phone, turning on the flashlight, and cautiously stepped out into the hallway. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but the footsteps she'd heard were gone. The corridor was empty, lit only by the dim of flickering sconces. "Hello," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. Then she saw it, the attic door. It was cracked open. Just like in the story she had read about Holly's last night. She felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew she shouldn't, but curiosity got the better of her. Gripping her phone tightly, she approached the attic stairs. As she climbed, the whispers began, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. Amelia paused, her pulse quickening. She wasn't alone up here. Someone was waiting. The attic was as cold as a crypt. Dust and cobwebs clung to the rafters, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on a shape in the corner. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as the figure came into view. It was Holly Arnold. She was sitting on the floor, her back to Amelia, her once vibrant hair hanging limply around her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, as if she hadn't seen the sun in ages. Amelia whispered, though she knew deep down this wasn't Holly, not anymore. The figure slowly turned her head, and Amelia took a step back in horror. Holly's eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness. Her mouth opened, and from her lips came the same haunting whispers that had plagued the inn for decades. Amelia stumbled backward, but as she did, the attic door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the whispers became unbearable. They were all around her now, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. "Leave," Holly's voice echoed. But it wasn't just Holly speaking, it was hundreds of voices, all overlapping, all screaming for freedom. Amelia backed into the corner, her phone flickering and then going dark. The room plunged into total blackness. She could hear movement shuffling, dragging, and then the feeling of cold fingers brushing against her arm. She screamed. The next morning, Mrs. Morley found Amelia huddled in the corner of the attic, trembling and incoherent. Her hair had gone white, and her eyes were wide with terror. The investigation into the Haxted Inn was closed shortly after. No one dared return after Amelia's collapse, and the inn was sealed off once more, the truth buried with it. But the whispers never stopped. Locals still claim, on quiet nights, if you stand outside the Haxted Inn, you can hear them, voices pleading, begging for release. Some say Holly Arnold's spirit is still trapped within those walls, waiting for someone to find her, but others warn that no one who enters the inn ever leaves the same, and if you listen closely, you'll hear their voices too. Whispers of the Forgotten. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.